Welcome to the International Society for Education Through Art, Latin America Regional Congress 2021. Rita Irwin is a distinguished university scholar, professor of art education and curriculum studies, former associate dean of teacher education and head of Department of Curriculum Studies at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. Rita has been an educational leader for a number of provincial, national, and international organizations, including the International Society for Education Through Art and chair of the World Alliance for Arts Education. Her research interests have spanned in service art education, teacher education, social cultural issues, and curriculum practices across kindergarten and informal learning settings. She's best known for her work in artography that expands how we might imagine and conduct arts practice-based research methodologies through collaborative and community-based collectives. She's very proud of her collected works, and edited volumes have been translated into Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese, and Turkish, with other works translated into Spanish, French, German, among other languages. Rita is an artist, researcher, and teacher deeply committed to arts, curriculum studies, and education. In recognition of her many accomplishments and commitments, she has received a number of awards for her work. While her life in education has offered her tremendous opportunities, she's especially proud of the many research creation projects she has pursued with her arts education colleagues and graduate students. It is in this space of living inquiry through the arts, curriculum studies, and education that has sustained her very being. It is with great joy that we are now going to listen to Professor Rita Irwin at the International Society for Education Through Art, Latin America Regional Congress 2021.
Thank you so much for this invitation to speak with you all today. I especially want to thank the organizers of the InSEA Congress on Cracks and Provocations in Arts Education, and for inviting me to give this presentation. I hope to inspire some provocations for all of you. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from a place that's now called Richmond, which is in the province of British Columbia in Canada, and that these lands are the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam First Nations peoples. And I also want to show appreciation to all Indigenous peoples of the world, and certainly their stewardship of our lands. So now I'm just going to share my screen and move into my PowerPoint presentation. And so I think many of you will see me up in the corner of your screen for the next little while. So what I'd like to do today is to share with you some of my thoughts on a project that I've been involved with over the last 15 or so years with some colleagues in arts and education here at my university. And this project, I have written about this project. You might have read some of the materials on it. And so I'm hoping that what I share with you today might offer some new thoughts for you. And the project is called Becoming Pedagogical. It brought together a range of arts educators as well as artists as we rethought how we might interrupt, disrupt, even reimagine secondary arts teacher education. teacher education has traditionally been, oops, I'm ahead of myself here. Teacher education has traditionally been concerned with learning how to teach. And we wanted to disrupt this idea. We wanted to set up the conditions so that our teacher candidates were also learning to learn rather than simply learning to teach. Now, admittedly, in the program, they had lots of opportunities on learning how to teach. There was a whole large program dedicated to that. But we wanted to really impress upon them this idea of becoming pedagogical as they embarked on their careers in education. So our premise was that as teachers, we can never learn enough, that we have to be in this disposition of learning to learn if we're going to be refreshing our knowledge all through our careers. So in this presentation, I share a pedagogical assemblage of projects, smaller projects within the larger project that unfolded from a real commitment to this concept of emergence. And so for me, that's a proposition that was really at the base of this whole Becoming Pedagogical project. So this idea of assemblage now, well, assemblage is an important concept here because it refers to a continual state of change from one state of being to another. So this is in contrast to a very static or fixed notion of self. So in this instance, teacher education and even education itself. So all of the projects that I'm sharing with you here is a part of this pedagogical assemblage. And each one of them take up this proposition of emergence. And you'll notice here that I'm not concentrating on research questions, but rather this idea of a proposition for inquiry. So I'm making a proposal for how we might inquire. So theoretically, a curricular state of emergence or space of emergence is where there's no predetermined endpoint, except to inquire into notions of interest. So for my research team, this meant inquiring into how teacher candidates might actually enact this idea of learning to learn as they thought about how they might work with students in their classrooms. So the concept of emergence is a process where properties that have never existed before, and sometimes are not even, or are not conceivable, they're not even inconceivable, are created or somehow come into being. So as with art, something new, something we haven't experienced before emerges. So Osberg, Biesta, and Colliers define it as a quest for knowledge that's not based on developing more accurate understandings of something that's a finished reality. Rather, the question for knowledge is more and more complex and creative ways of interacting. In other words, this is not about fitting into a structure of knowledge, but rather creating knowledge through experience of emergence. So as we engage with learning environments, we come to new understandings. So as it is, we construct knowledge through our encounters with environments and also through our own participatory actions in those environments. So it's here that we need to really recognize when emergence happens and when it's possible. We need to appreciate also the temporal nature of knowledge, like it happens in time, and sometimes that time feels constricted and sometimes it seems quite large. So as we take the time to be actively engaged with our learning, we shift our curriculum efforts away from questions regarding presentation and representation, and instead we look to how we might be engaged with creating knowledge. So one thing I want you to take away today is just this idea of emergence, and that it's a wonderful proposition that we want to be engaged in this idea of emergence and that as being at the basis of artography. I'm going to concentrate today on a couple ideas. The first one is around interventions. And I define an intervention as what an intervention is concerned with creating provocative differences that inspire learning experiences for or with others. So in this instance, what is important to remember here is that one instance needs other instances. So we do not come to understand through one experience. In fact, we need multiple experiences of something before we really begin to understand. So that's the idea of an intervention. We need to try something different, and we need multiple experiences of that difference before it makes an impact. And the second idea has to do with, I think I've gone ahead here, hang on, an intervention. I don't know why it went ahead there, sorry about that. And interventions. So this is different than an intervention. An intravention, we look to Deleuze, who sees another form of difference as being inside of oneself. It exists as an intensity within the life of an individual. So this intensity may ebb and flow, but it's always continuous. So we're calling this an intravention. So the intervention is something we're doing to or with others, whereas an intravention happens within ourselves. So in both instances, Deleuze understands multiplicities as differentiating process, just continually differentiating processes. They can't be quantified. And we also want to resist decomplexifying them. That means they need to remain complex. So my reason for focusing on these two lenses is to suggest that as we evoke or even provoke, in this case for this conference, provocation is important, that emergence is very important to our artographic work. So in the first instance, an intervention affords us an opportunity to see how multiple projects can unfold from one proposition of emergence. And in the second, this idea of intervention affords us an opportunity to see how experiencing a proposition of emergence generates an unfolding of ideas within ourselves. So the first is external and the second is internal. And both emerge in and through time. They both need time. It's not something that we can quickly arrive at. We need time with these. So in the first instance, I'm going to give you an example of an intervention. So in this case, I'm going to juxtapose a project that took place in a secondary visual arts teacher education program. And then I'm going to move to another example about how an artographic emergence is a good way of explaining an experience on practicum for a teacher candidate. So I have two instances here. So first of all, and you might have read about this because I have written about this project, but I'd like to talk about it a bit here nevertheless. So in our program, we've noticed that a lot of teacher candidates may or may not have a good understanding of art as social practice. So we wanted to experiment by making sure our teacher candidates had an experience with several artists who are engaged in art as social practice. So we brought two artists into our program and opened up a 3-week period when the two artists could work with our teacher candidates. The two artists are on the left here, Helen Jickling and Hannah Reed. And they chose the Summerhill text, which was written a few decades ago. It was a revolutionary way of thinking about rearing children. A.S. Neal critiqued and reimagined society and schooling in this text. And there was a Summerhill school that was created in the UK following this philosophy. And what the social practice artists did was they found enough used copies of this book to give every student in our course a copy. And so then what happened is that the teacher candidates started to read the text, to look at what was in the margins, because remember, these are all used books. So then looking in the margins to see what was there, and then to begin interacting with these texts. And so here's some artistic ways of engaging with this text. So what's emerging for them? What are some of the ideas that are so provocative for them? And what do you do with these ideas? In some instances, some of these, they're looking at the real qualities of the book. Some of them are treating them as art objects. In some cases, they really want to pull out some ideas they don't want to forget, and maybe some other ones they really want to provoke us to think more about. I think the idea of, like in this instance, the almost erasing of ideas and letting other ones emerge, or to have people really think alongside text and what's in the margins. The idea of what's in the margins, like what's happening outside of what we tend to understand. This is all really important for all of us. They not only looked at these books, but they decided to take the students on a field trip. And we went just a little bit out beyond the university to some natural spaces, took the books, talked about the books, some of the material in the books there, went on walks. So there was this also taking learning beyond the university into some other milieu, and to really talk about what happens when we go into these new spaces. And ironically, as they were finding, they started to look for, again, thinking about emergence, what's emerging. So another idea was, well, are there other places called Summerhill? And they discovered there was a Summerhill senior citizen residence. So many of them took another field trip to that residence. So that was a really exciting way and when they were at that residence, they really thought differently about what was teaching and learning, especially in the arts. They also decided to do a new version of the book. And so as they worked into the book, they decided to go to a bookbinding, I should say, place. So they learned about bookbinding, and eventually we created a new book. And you can see all of the student names and how we revised the book. And so you can see there's 40 copies of the book here. And eventually we decided to put on an exhibition of the used books. You can see them there, and also, oops, sorry. And as I showed you there, there was also a copy of all the books there, 1 to 40. And so what was interesting about this project was having the students really separate themselves from their course for a little while, and to think quite differently, quite radically different about what was teaching and learning, because there's a lot of very different ideas in this book, but also to think about the book object and how the object itself can help us to think differently about how we come to know something. What I'd like to do now is to move forward with the second one here around the Autographic Practicum. So in that first instance, it was about the artist coming into the teacher ed program and interrupting it. So the intervention, they were interrupting it with this social practice project. In this instance, it's about people who've been learning about artography and them going on practicum. So I wish to share with you here what we learned from studying one of our teacher candidates who very luckily was placed with a teacher in the school who calls herself an artographer. And so here we had a student teacher who was also an artographer. And so the two of them together were taking up our artographic inquiry. So in this instance, artographic inquiry provided the opportunity for both the teacher candidate and the school advisor to create art and to discuss teaching philosophies and pedagogical practices, and to really change the practicum performance into an extra out of the ordinary event. So studying this pair became like a small little research project for us because we hadn't anticipated this. And so this was something that emerged for us. We hadn't intended it, but it was an opportunity. And we were able to learn about the qualitative experiences that both of them had, not only the teacher candidate, but also the school advisor. And we came to learn that when both of these individuals employ art making strategies as a form of inquiry, they both benefit from collegial conversation. So it was interesting. We always have our teacher candidates, for instance, keep a journal and reflect on their practices while they're on practicum. And in this instance, the teacher candidate not only reflected through written reflections, but also through artistic reflections, and then shared those with her school advisor, who in turn also gave some artistic reflections of what was happening with the teacher candidate. So it wasn't just written or verbal, it was also this artistic inquiry that was being shared. So that was quite a wonderful experience. So as we think about this, 4 themes emerged from what we learned from this small project. And that was this idea of becoming pedagogical is that, yes, that started at the university during the coursework, where we're trying to encourage our teacher candidates to think about always learning and always being engaged with thinking about pedagogy. And certainly on practicum, this continued. And when you have both the school advisor and teacher candidate thinking like that, both are showing that they're learning from one another and they're learning alongside each other. What was so interesting here was this idea of becoming through art making, that both of them engaged in art making practices as they reflected on their experiences, made a big impact on their what each was learning. And that this idea of becoming an active inquirer, always in the state of inquiry, and this idea of becoming relational, that this was really important between them. That it wasn't just about the teachers with the students in the classroom, it was also between the school advisor and the teacher candidate. So it was so interesting because the teacher candidate learned about becoming pedagogical as she took risks with experimentation. And she recognizes that both the teacher candidate and the school advisor really kind of moved back and forth between their teacher identity and also their artistic identities. And at the same time, understanding that the practicum was a pretty busy place, and yet there's still room for some artographic living inquiry. It does require some slowing down so that she could attend to some questions for herself and her students. But ultimately, this provided a place for deepening relationships. And it also allowed for more relational understanding among all those involved. So now I'd like to move to this idea of intraventions. So in this portion of the presentation, I just want to share a couple projects that came about from, and this was very much a surprise to us, because when we designed this project, we weren't really thinking about us. We were thinking more about the teacher candidates and how we could add a provocation to the teacher ed program. We hadn't really fully anticipated how it was going to affect us as instructors. And we had 2 PhD candidates who were teaching a couple of the courses that our teacher candidates were taking at the time. And as a result, both of them experienced these teacher candidates before and after the time when the artists who were involved in social practice came into our program. And so they saw the difference with our teacher candidates. And they saw the difference in what the implications were for themselves and how they thought about teacher education and how they thought about their own program. So as a result of this, we began to conceptualize what happened for each of us, all of us who were involved in the research project, the ones who were teaching the students and the one who were researching. And we began to look at those inward looking conceptual realizations that change our trajectories of inquiry. So the intervention was an externally organized interruption into the program, but what happened for each of us was that it changed our own individual inquiry. So it ultimately changed us as well, is what I'm saying. So one of the PhD candidates who's now finished the program, Adrienne Bolton-Funke, talks about her intervention through the notion of a duration of ontology. And she uses Deleuze's concept of duration as a way to reconceptualize how the disruptions into her perceptions of her teaching and research projects caused her to argue what I have here on the screen. She says, rather than an epistemological form of research focused on what is known about teaching, the intervention provoked an ontological form of research into the yet unknowable. This shift is unique in that rather than utilizing processes of reflection to learn from experiences as past, this research explored learning through experience to create new potentials. So something new, something we hadn't anticipated. So this shift displaces the discrete compartmentalization of time as past, present, and future, and instead favors an attentiveness to the embodied, affective dimension of experience that draws both memories and future desires into the present. So it becomes about the here and now. So we spend a lot of time reflecting in teacher education. This is more about what are we learning for right now, and how can we take this forward? So for her, this intervention really caused her to re-examine the hierarchical power structures between teachers in our teacher ed program and students in our program. And how really we need to spend more time learning alongside each other. So even as instructors, we need to be becoming pedagogical, that we also need to be learning alongside our teacher candidates. Another person that was really involved as an instructor and also a PhD student at the time, her name is Natalie Leblanc. And she extends this discussion by thinking about a metaphor that she uses a lot called the wake of ontology. So metaphorically, the wake is what's left behind a moving boat, as the kind of ripple effects behind a boat as it's moving forward. And so those are traces of movement that eventually recede off into the distance. So for her, the intervention is where we feel our own becoming with an aesthetic network that is distributed in time and space. And so as the wake implies, this stance requires surrender. So at some point we need to surrender. We need to take in what it is that we're learning. So a pivot to becoming conscious of how our movements are affected by change. So the intervention as the wake is the semblance of an event, a lived abstraction of the event that makes it qualitatively more intense. So it's so interesting to me that even though this was just a 3-week interruption into the program, that intervention was just basically 3 weeks, we felt it. We felt the ripple effects of it. We felt the wake of it all through the following year with our teacher candidates. We would keep coming back to it. We would keep reminding ourselves of what it was we'd learned in that time and how we might want to take it up further. And so as we thought about that, we realized that what we learn from an intervention never ends, is that every time we think back on that event and how we provoked ourselves to think differently about learning, to learn, it's causing us right now to think differently about how we're learning to learn. So it's really about a continuous way of thinking about emergence as a space of potential. And it's here that Natalie Leblanc conceives of a pivot between an intervention and an intravention. And this is where we kind of pull everything together, where we need both, actually. we recognize that the work changes us and we change the work because we are the work. So yes, in this teacher ed program, we invited these artists in for 3 weeks, and the teacher candidates were changed, the instructors were changed, and ultimately what they do with their students in classrooms is probably changed. It's not just in that moment. We continue to change as we think back on that experience. So let me just try to pull this together here. So the concepts of interventions and intraventions demonstrate that kind of breadth and depth, or the warp and the weft, the network of lines of flight that develop when ideas are allowed to emerge through rhizomatic generativity. And they all began from a proposition of emergence, that we allow ourselves to be in this space of emergence, this very generative space for learning. They underscore how artography is simultaneously a form of research, as well as a form of pedagogy, and also as a form of creative practice that is inherently a generative engagement that can be understood through Deleuzian ontological concepts that have been mentioned. So during this presentation, I've mentioned several Deleuzian concepts: assemblage, duration, becoming, and multiplicity. Those are all really important to thinking about emergence for artography. So as I draw this presentation to a close, I return to artography itself, reminding us that it is a practice of emergent inquiry. It is that emergent unfolding of conceptual ideas that breathes new life into our art, into our pedagogy, and into our practices of inquiry. So a Deleuzian ontology of being and becoming is important to this discussion and provides a space for emergence to unfold. So I hope that this presentation has provided some rich examples of artography's capacity for emergence to unfold, particularly through these notions of interventions and intraventions. And I want to just end by thanking everyone for attending this presentation. And I also end with just noting my contact information, my email address, my website address, and also the artography website address. Because if you explore that website, you'll find a number of resources, publications, books, projects, etc. So if this is something that really is of interest to you, I would encourage you to spend a little time on the website and to get to know a bit more. So thank you for attending, and I'm just going to stop sharing right now, so I can return and maybe have a little bit of a discussion or follow up with Lucia.
Thank you so much, Rita. I'd like to congratulate you on your lecture, and you brought us so many interesting ideas. I'd like to ask you about one of them, okay. If you can say a little bit more about it. I think that you know this year Congress starts by inviting us to think that pedagogy strives to open cracks and provoke learning, unlearning, and relearning. And you talked about how intervention and intravention affords us opportunities to learn, to see how experiencing a proposition of emergence generates unfolding of ideas within ourselves and together with others. So I'd like to know if you can talk a little bit more about how do you think this intervention and intravention can be present in all of us? We are in a Latin America Congress, and schools are very different around these places we are in. So do you think that we can live this experience in every school that we are in here in Latin America?
Well, that's such a good question. Thank you. You know, one thing I've thought about a lot in my career is that we have art in our curriculum so that students will not only learn about the world as a visual place, but also to be thinking differently, to take some risks, to be creative, to disrupt some of what we've learned in other disciplines, perhaps, or to be provocative. So I think that our art education classrooms should be a different experience from other classrooms. So if an art education classroom feels like a social studies classroom or a language classroom or a science classroom, then we're probably not doing a good job. So what I'm suggesting here is, you know, when we invite artists in, they can get us to think differently. Oftentimes they can provoke us to take up ideas that perhaps we hadn't thought about. But more importantly, here in this presentation, we were disrupting even the structures of education. Now, admittedly, that's a privilege that we could take 3 weeks and not assess it, not evaluate it. What I mean by that is that we weren't testing the students on anything. We weren't having them submit something for assessment based on those 3 weeks. It was simply there as an experience to get them to learn to learn. I think we need to have more experiences where it's about learning, and that we're not so concerned with always evaluating, because as soon as we have to evaluate everything, then the learning becomes about the evaluation. It becomes destined for that. What happens when you give emergence more credibility is it goes somewhere you didn't anticipate. So it goes like, it's like when the artist brought in the Summerhill text, I never thought of the Summerhill text as being a text for art education. And then we looked at what was in the margins. I never thought of that before. When we went on a field trip to a place called Summerhill, I never thought of that before. So there was all these things that began to emerge. And then at every step, students were learning something different. So when you opened the question with, you know, this conference is on cracks and provocations, I think that's a wonderful concept, by the way, for a conference. Because, you know, Leonard Cohen, who's a Canadian singer and poet. You know, he's written about the crack. The crack is where the light comes in, and we see more because the light comes through the crack. Cracks are wonderful because we see something that we didn't intend to see. And provocations are those wonderful kind of nudges or experiments that interrupt us and get us to think differently. So I think that all around the world, art educators should take opportunities to disrupt the curriculum so it doesn't look like every other curriculum in the school, and so that it feels qualitatively different, and that there's more space for emergence, more space for things to unfold and to build from what unfolds. And then, you know, that's a more artistic life as well. I know that's a long answer, but hopefully it's
a
helpful.
beautiful question, answer. And I'd like to know if I can ask you one more question.
Yes, of course, of course.
Rita, do you think that orthography went through or suffered any conceptual or methodological changes during the pandemic?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. You know, it's interesting to me because when I look at my own graduate student community, before the pandemic, we met regularly. We would have, I'll give you an example. We had we'd meet like monthly and go for an extended walk. We were creative together, and we read together and discussed together. And when the pandemic came and we couldn't do that, as a group, we decided to come together actually every 2 weeks, but have gone on our own independent walks and to share images, some discussions on our readings and our. So it's interesting to me. It's like the pandemic taught me that we need our own inquiries, our own artistic inquiries, even more. It's like it's a lifeline. It's a lifeline to ourselves. It's a lifetime to one another, that we absolutely need to be involved in our own artistic exploration and inquiry. It really saves us in a time when we feel isolated, cut off, and certainly separate from others. So artography kind of, where I am anyway, artography became even bigger. It seemed like it was more important in what it offered. Yeah, I really learned a lot there about what people need. People need to be together, and they need to be continuously working on their own creative work. I knew that before, but I learned it in a whole new way during the pandemic.
Wow, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Rita. Due to our speaking time today, we need to close now. It's a pity, but I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to being here with you, to listen to you, and to learn a lot during this time we've been together. I thank you so much, Rita Irwin, and thank you all for participating. Bye-bye.
Gracias.
Obrigada.